great sessions throughout the rest of today and tomorrow. And I'm going to hand it over to David Leeds. He's our Senior Manager of Smart Grid Research at GreenTech Media and GTM Research. Welcome, David.
Hey everyone, good morning. Well, I guess I'd like to first start off by welcoming everyone. This is our third network grid. I see a lot of familiar faces and colleagues, and it's great to have you all here this morning. And you know, it's actually great to be in California. California has been something of a test lab for GreenTech and Smart Grid over the last 5 years, and you know, a lot of innovation has been born here, and hopefully this will continue to be a place where a lot of great innovation has evolved over the next decade. This is actually a quote that I got in the Fortune magazine recently. I do all have handouts if you want to follow along. So. And then today, I guess I want to start off by talking about just 5 high-level trends in smart grid. And clearly, the growth of distribution automation and what we're calling the smart circuit or the green circuit is the direction the industry is going in. We're going to talk about that in this presentation. And apart from that, obviously, can you guys hear me okay? You know, there's been a little bit of, there's so many great things. Having studied this and researched this over the last 5 years, so much awareness and technology deployment increase has happened over the last 5 years. And there's been a little bit of setbacks, but primarily around consumer engagement. So that's another trend to be aware of. And you know, the question really becomes, how do we provide tangible benefits and give the customer a sense of empowerment and value for these multi-billion-dollar investments? Other trends, and the third one there, is realizing the network infrastructure. And I guess what I mean by that is not just from a utility perspective, but from also a regulator perspective and even a legislative perspective. You know, here in California, Governor Jerry Brown is now signing into law 33% renewable mandates. And I think, you know, at that level, at the state government level, even at the federal level, there's still a disconnect between increased distributed generation and renewables in general and the smart grid. So understanding that the network itself really becomes the foundation for all the technologies that we're looking to embed and all the applications we're trying to run into this grid, I think that's a really important message to continue to put out there, and that's also part of the reason we call this the network grid 3 years in a row. Along with the network infrastructure, particularly PV and electric vehicles are really 2 applications because they're physical and visceral, and consumers can kind of understand them very easily. They actually help the market evolve. 1, because of the technical challenges, which we'll talk about. 2, because you know, in terms of getting to our green tech future, those are 2 of the most sort of consumer-touching applications of the smart grid. And then the last trend here is utility consolidation and mega mergers. You know, 5 years ago when I was talking to utilities, oftentimes utilities would say, well, you know, unfortunately we're only 2 million customers. We don't have the power to influence the vendors. You know, we can get together as 3 or 4 and form some kind of band of brothers. But now what's happening with Exelon, you know, merging with Constellation if that deal goes through, and with Duke in the Progress deal, there's new buying power, which is really interesting, which could, you know, of course, provide economies of scale in purchasing, but also could influence the market in terms of standards, in terms of new business models, and in terms of actually the pursuit of greater green tech growth. So it's just one more thing to watch for over the next few years here. I'm going to start off with smart grid, what we call 1.0, and that's largely to do with metering. Well, you know, metering is an important part of the smart grid, but it's an application of the smart grid. It's not the smart grid, and the way that it was kind of originally you know, marketed to the public, people started to think smart metering and smart grid sort of as one and the same thing. Clearly they are not, but I think the good news in terms of federal funding and more utilities, whether they be IOUs or munis or co-ops that are getting into metering, is that they're actually laying the seeds for grid communications. And this is just the top 25, primarily IOUs apart from SMUD, and they're looking to be close to 50 million smart meters over the next 5 years. And then if you include the rest of the munis and the government utilities, you're at somewhere between 50 and 70 million meters with a penetration rate of close to 50% by 2015. So that's Smart Grid 1.0, and that's got considerable legs right now. But we actually see that as a small portion of the total smart grid pie, and it's exciting, but it's not the most exciting thing. We of course think distribution automation. That's when you think about smart grid. That's where the intelligence needs to go on the actual grid. So moving on, just looking at sort of the focus of the nation, this is the stimulus funds. I guess a lot gets made about what was $4.5 billion in total when you add the demonstration projects. But to my eye, I think the most important thing about the RS stimulus is that it's caused a lot of utilities to really focus their energies on smart grid and put timelines in place and have enterprise-wide leadership in addressing smart grid. But if you look at the funds for distribution automation, just in terms of standalone projects, DA only received $200 million, which is 7% of the investment grants. So not a lot. Of course, there is some in the integrated systems portion, the larger part. But I have to tip my hats to the guys that are doing AMI marketing because they really captured the attention of the industry, and you can see how that's gone. And that's not a bad thing. Continuing with grid communications, communications are rapidly evolving, and when you talk to utilities, you hear the same thing again and again. It's that David, we're just trying to understand what works and what doesn't. I must have heard that more times than I can count over the last 2 years. So that's still it, and we're in pilot stage in many places, but there's a lot of learning that's been done. And of course, this is a situation where there's no one approach that's going to work. Whether you're in a downtown dense urban area or a rural area, there's going to be different spectrums and protocols that will serve each solution. And even you can think about with Hurricane Katrina and disasters in Japan, we're going to need to have communications that are always going to be on. And so I wouldn't be surprised to even see more satellite coming into the picture over the next 10 years. Of course, communication strategies always need to be flexible and upgradable so that when new products come along, they can plug into the network that already exists. And where the communication is in terms of DA is that we have put forth a lot of these mesh networks for AMI. And right now we're currently still trying to understand how to utilize those networks because frankly a lot of the applications in terms of control and protection in DA, they require sub-millisecond latencies. And you can't always get that through a mesh hop network. So we're trying to figure out today what can we do? Can we do things like asset management? It seems so, yes. And using the voltage reads off of those meters to kind of fit into the outage management and DMS systems that exist today. And just in terms of communications, the trend here is sensors moving towards the edge, sensors moving towards the load demand. So that's kind of, if you think of communications sort of stretching, that's where this is heading right now. And then as we move to what we call Smart Grid 2.0, and that's distribution automation, we're talking about a wide array of potential advances that will give utilities and operators digital control over the power delivery network, and things like solid-state transformers, of course, new communication technologies, data processing and analytics. And I think it's important to just kind of understand, when we talk about DA, there are really 4 main parts to this. And those 4 parts are system reliability, so in things like outage restoration and applications like Flizzr, which I'll talk about, grid optimization, effective integration of distributed generation, and lastly, asset utilization and protection. And these are all enabled by, as we were saying, new sensors and communication communication technology and a whole new generation of dynamic devices. And then as we surveyed utilities, one thing we were trying to figure out is, to what degree are they aware of the possibility to piggyback their networks to start to do distribution automation and grid optimization. And 60% of utilities are now considering using their existing networks for DA. And the flip side of that is if you ask utilities, can these networks adequately perform for distribution automation? A lot of people are unsure. Almost half the people we asked, utility executives, weren't sure if they could do all DA applications using the existing networks. And I think that gets to the performance requirements of distribution automation, where for advanced metering, your latency allowance is relatively high, and your reliability is relatively low. And for distribution automation, it's exactly the opposite, where your latency allowance is very low, and your reliability is very high. So, it's sort of a whole new set of requirements that utilities have to face. And then, in terms of just thinking about, the role of communications and the need for low latency, broadband becomes a big part of the discussion. And it was just about a year ago, or in March of 2010, that the FCC introduced the National Broadband Plan. And the question is, with electricity, the reason we had the Roaring 20s is because it was sort of socialized so that anyone could get electricity, right? And the question is, do we do the same thing with broadband? It doesn't seem like there's been much movement, by the way, in the FCC, but is it conceivable that carriers don't make money selling broadband, as the utilities don't make money selling energy, and instead they get some kind of rate-based recovery for providing broadband? I don't know, but it's certainly something that the federal government has suggested, with the promise of 100 million households having broadband. Because the point is, if we all have broadband, then a lot of the applications we're trying to run, we can just use the broadband networks to run those applications. So it'll be interesting to see what the penetration of broadband is in the U.S. over the next 5 or 10 years. And to my eye, the percentage of broadband sort of speaks to how much the U.S. is going to be a leading nation going forward. So I really hope that does take off. And then sort of broadly speaking, when you read websites about DA, what is it? And the broad objectives are more reliable, more secure, more energy efficient, more resilient. We had the 2003 blackout, and a tree falls in Ohio. Does it make a sound? Well, it does if you don't have some sort of distribution automation that can quickly isolate that fault and provide power to the rest of the network, and not having some sort of massive cascading effect. So resiliency and self-healing become big parts of DA, as well as being responsible and as we've talked about, integrating DGADVs. Right now, when people say DA, they're usually talking about one of two things. The first is fault location and isolation. Fault location, isolation, and service restoration, which is, I guess the acronym is FLISR. FLISR is the type of acronym you get when, I love engineers, but when engineers make acronyms, that's what you come up with. So we've got FLISR. And then we've got volt var, which is to do with the optimization of voltage and reactive power. Those are the two leading applications of DA right now, and with the possibility of load balancing in terms of energy storage and having batteries near substations, and even moving some of that storage towards the customer as being the third application that we're expecting to come on more in 2012 and 2013. And when you think about the architectures for DA, there's really two different approaches, and or even you can take three. There's a hybrid approach as well, but there's the approach of having centralized distribution automation, where there's intelligence in the master computer at the substation, or you can have decentralized, which is sort of where the industry is moving, where there's just a lot more peer-to-peer communications between devices and switches. The advantages of centralized is that they can consider the system impacts, because you're getting a lot more data being used. And we can utilize AMI, fault current indicators and protective relays. And disadvantages of centralized architecture is its slow response because of the latency, and more training for system operators. And you need to have a robust communication system in place to do centralized DA. Whereas decentralized, you get faster response times, quicker restoration, and less error from because you're kind of human independent, or dependent. And there's more off-the-shelf equipment available for decentralized. The disadvantages for decentralized is that these networks typically don't consider larger system operations. So you may not be getting data from the meters or data from GIS or weather. So they're still very kind of siloed solutions. So we've kind of yet to bring that together. But like as I mentioned, more sensors towards the edge is the trend of the industry, and having the equipment talk to each other. I mean, this is really end-to-end. This is the Internet of Things, and this is a huge trend right now in technology in all kinds of sectors. And along with healthcare, the grid is going to be one of the first places where we really see the advancement of end-to-end communication. This next slide, actually, there should be, for improved system efficiency, should be its own subcategory. So in talking about how to get DA installed, of course, one needs to make a business case. And today, it's really the first two, which is reliability benefits and improved system efficiency, that all the utilities that I'm talking to are making the case in those two areas. And in terms of the technologies that attach to each one of those four, reliability is Flizzr, as we were just talking about. And I'll show you a slide on Flizzr in a second. And that's self-healing and advanced metering. System efficiency is volt-var optimization. So that's using DMS and cap banks and voltage regulators to just improve using algorithms to improve the running of the grid. Advanced asset management, that's putting sensors for condition-based maintenance as opposed to just when the thing breaks down. When you consider that the average distribution transformer in the U.S. is approaching 40 years old, getting a lot more condition-based maintenance is it's critical. And then the technologies involved with DG and EV integration are smart inverters and having more data and other new technologies there. And I think it's interesting. Sometimes utilities say, well, we can't get the business case for DA, but it really comes down to, are there penalties and other incentives in place? And in utilities in Australia, the penalties are so huge for reliability that it's a no-brainer to start putting automatic restoration on the grid that's there. And I was talking to a utility at Northeast Utilities last week, and they said, well, our line losses are actually quite low. So reliability was really the way we could, make the case to our commission. Whereas 15 minutes later, I was talking to APS, and they were Arizona Public Service, and they were saying we've got 7% line losses. So what we did, and when we put in volt-var, we dropped that to 3%. So that's a pretty substantial example of the type of savings you can experience from volt-var. This next slide is just kind of showing a timeline without and with Flizzr. And without Flizzr, you can see a fault occurs, and then 10 minutes goes by, and the customer calls the utility, and then there's another 15 or 30 minutes to drive out to look for the fault, and another 20 minutes to locate the fault, and then another 20 minutes before you can manually turn that switch. So you're at between 45 and 2 hours before you've turned off the power and restored power to the healthy customers. Whereas with Flizzr, before the customer even reports the outage, the power has already been restored to the healthy section of the feeder. So, I mean, this is exactly the kind of evolution and self-healing that we're moving towards, and it's clear that the technology works. So there's no arguments on that end. So it's just sort of about moving this forward through the PUCs. The non-economic drivers, on the policy front, we talked a little bit about the portfolio requirements for intermittent power. And the fact is we still have this Edison grid in place, this legacy grid. So we're really having to think about re-architecting the grid, and in some cases you can be removing sequence changes so that you get more voltage to the end. But when we start adding electric vehicles and solar panels, it's just going to take a wide, holistic thinking to integrate both the hardware and the software to make it work. And obviously EV adoption, we've spoken about this on the website and in conferences before, has a drastic effect on the load profile of the transformers, and can easily take one of the phases out of balance or above or below the 132 or 108 voltage threshold. This is our forecast for DA over the next 5 years, and we really see it growing. Whereas today it's catching up to AMI. We have it a little bit ahead of AMI here. Maybe that's a little bit optimistic, but unfortunately, it's not that easy to get historical data on distribution automation. Some utilities, notably in California, will say we've been doing it for 20 years, but the type of technologies that they're talking about aren't really where this is going. In some cases it is, but we're kind of working on a report right now. We're pulling the top 100 IOUs, and today, in 2010, 2011, about 20 to 25% of IOUs have DA projects either underway or completed. And when you survey these utilities, it looks like 40 to 50% of IOUs by 2015 are going to have DA programs in place. So that's a remarkable jump, and consequently, we see this market doubling and really taking the lion's share of smart grid over the next decade. And our forecast, there's so many technologies to consider, but we kind of simplified it into the four main pieces of hardware. So our forecast is predicated on the eventual deployment of reclosers, not the typical, the next generation reclosers that are communicating back to the substation in real time. Automated feeder switches, both of those you need for self-healing, and then cap banks and voltage regulators, which play a huge role in grid optimization. So those are the four technologies, and once again, the grid is a legacy grid. Average transformer is older than 40 years old. And, we're at this point now where the leading communication solution for DA is yet to be anointed, so that's where we are in 2011. And what we realize is sub 30 millisecond latencies will be required. And as I was saying, if you can go from 6% line losses to 3% line losses using gold bar, that's a solution that's attractive to everyone. Although, I have to say, in states that are deregulated, or here in California where you're decoupled, it's actually interesting because when you save 3% at the T&D level, those savings go to the generator and they go to the consumer, but the utility actually doesn't capitalize on that. So thinking about new business models that can incentivize the utility to share in that reward, I think is going to be really important as we think about increasing the use for voltage bar. And then this is our forecast, thinking about what a smart grid looks like in the U.S. over the next 5 years. And the way we did this is we said, looking at the country, we thought, okay, at full U.S. deployment, we would need about 1.5 million reclosers, 78,000 feeder switches, 3 million cap banks, and 3 million voltage regulators. And so at very low percentages, half of 1% percentage in 2010 and under 1% in 2011, you get to 11,000 reclosers added and 22,000 cap banks, and at a cost of $20,000 a recloser and $35,000 a cap bank, you quickly get to, in 2011, 1.6 in new devices, and if you use a multiplier of 2 for communications, you're at 3.3 billion. So that's kind of how we see the market growing and approaching 6 billion in 2015. And apart from the cap banks and the voltage regulators, tap changers become another really important technology, which today you really can't alter more than 2 or 3 times at the most, because they're just not designed for that kind of, that much use. So a whole new generation of tap changers needs to be born, so that you can alter the voltage at the substation to affect the voltage at the endpoint. And today, a lot of substations, you might have one tap changer at a substation that has 4 to 6 feeders. So ultimately, we're going to get to a point where we're going to need 1 tap changer on every feeder. So it just all speaks to a bigger and bigger market for these DA solutions. And then getting to a time and place where we're no longer switching load from substation A to substation B, but you're actually could be switching load from phase A to phase B. If on phase A there's too many electric vehicles charging, and that's spiking the voltage up. Shifting that net load, or shifting net load from another phase to phase A, that could, or actually if you're charging too much, you'd be sagging the voltage. So shifting load from another phase to the phase in trouble, that's the type of next generation switching we're moving towards. And then just in terms of the existing grid infrastructure, it's easy to imagine the future grid, but if you look at this legacy grid we're still using today, the fact is ubiquitous EMS and SCADA at the substation in a lot of places is still missing. I was talking to Kansas City Power and Light last week, and of their 315 distribution substations, 270 have inadequate or no communication. So we're thinking about how do we do all these things to make the grid intelligent? How do we embed sensors everywhere? How do we kind of integrate OMS and DMS and get to this grid that's talking in real time and all the devices that are communicating? But the fact of the matter is today, at some utilities, you've got 50 to, this isn't, in California it's a lot more advanced, but just as a nation, we're lacking the basic communication infrastructure necessary to make these changes. And of their 855 feeders / breakers that communicate to SCADA, 50% are using electric mechanical relays. So that's not smart grid. So there's huge room for investment, and there's big business opportunity here. And then in terms of, before we can get to the edge of the grid, substation automation obviously is very important. We have the 61850 standard in place so that different IEDs from all kinds of manufacturers can communicate. But it's getting more substation automation at the larger substation, and this idea, and we're doing a report on this right now, the smart enterprise, where all of your applications, which today are quite siloed. Even today at some advanced utilities, you still have separate screens for SCADA and EMS, for DMS, and outage management. So the data is now beginning to be shared, but the operator's still having to look at 3 screens. And it's the integration of all these, all the data into sort of a centralized command using real-time information from the grid that's going to take this into the next decade. So those are kind of just all important points in terms of thinking about where we are today. And of course, this is the house that we all want. This is somewhere in Palo Alto where you have an electric vehicle and solar panels and home area networks. But the fact of the matter is that this home today plays havoc on the grid, and it's probably presenting the distribution utility more problems than it is benefit. So in thinking about the impacts of solar, EV, and kind of touched on the fact that the phases could become wildly imbalanced if you have, today oftentimes what happens is that in the middle of the day in Southern California and other sunny spots, the voltage actually spikes above the 132 threshold, which forces the IEEE 1547 standard to kick in and trip off the solar panel so it stops producing energy. That to me is not our smart energy future. We're trying to capture green, clean technology, but if it's rising the voltage too high at the edge of the distribution grid, we just shut it off. So finding ways to integrate that energy either through storage or smarter inverters and communication networks is a big part of this. And along with that, I mentioned, at the substation, you need more robust tap changers and voltage regulators on the grid that can work in much closer to real time to balance the effect of the DG and EVs. Because what you would like to do is either using a tap changer or the voltage regulators when phase spikes to 132. The utility wants to drop phase B and C closer to 1.8 to bring them back into level. And then, lastly, just thinking about our research, we're primarily a solar research firm and a smart grid research firm. And what's interesting and fun is that the convergence of these two is moving really quickly. We had an event in Jersey City last winter called the Network Solar. And, anytime you move from a centralized architecture, whether in networking or using laptops with the internet, or from centralized to a distributed architecture, it always prevents massive opportunities, and there's big change in terms of business process and operations. But this is where we are, moving towards the distributed utility of the future. And today, certain circuits, they're already crossing 20% integration or threshold of PV. So, where the questions become what technologies, whether they be smart inverters or something else, storage, to help accommodate this. And, at what point in time is energy storage affordable for consumers and affordable for utilities to put more of it both at the edge and at the substation. You're seeing the beginning of that, but we're hoping to see a lot of growth over the next decade. And, and so the possibilities there to do all kinds of things and not only inject power, but far. So there's just a lot of new ways of looking at the grid and more data, like integration of weather and GIS becomes a really important point in all this. And just as we kind of prepare for the next 2 days, other topics that I think merit mentioning is the management of data from meters, which is substantial, and sort of enterprise planning. So we have a panel on that. We've got a panel on smart grid security and talking about the NERC SIP standards and issues ranging from physical security to consumer privacy. Home area networks continue to be, I think one of the ways where we can say to the customer, hey, we're giving you, this is the empowerment that we're providing through advanced metering. You're getting your data in real time, and now you can make decisions about how you want to affect your energy use. And as I mentioned, the first billion of the 4.5 in our stimulus funds have been released. And we're going to have the top 3 IOUs in California come on the stage in a few minutes and talk about their 2020 plan, their roadmap. And I think also with the stimulus, it's maybe not an incredible amount of money, $4.5 billion. I mean, $4.5 billion is probably the capital budget of an average 2 million customer utility. So when you think about how many utilities there are in the country, it's not a lot. But what it has done is it's caused utilities to focus their energies. And then, what we've been impressed by is that, it's easy to kind of make regulators the bad guy. But in conversations we're having in states across the U.S., it seems the PUC's mind share about smart grid really is changing, and that they do understand the real benefit of distribution automation, and they're trying to find ways, like in Ohio, there's Senate Bill 221 that incentivizes utilities to reduce energy use. And the last point is that this is an industry that's experiencing phenomenal growth, and there's been all kinds of mergers over the last 2 years, and we heard another big rumor just a few days ago, which I could probably share better off stage. But this is an industry that's experiencing phenomenal growth, and there's huge market opportunities, and I think it's very exciting, and I'm very happy that you're all here. So thank you, and welcome to the Network Grid. So with that, it's my honor to welcome to